First of all, let me really thank this terrific organizer for all this job they did. And it seems that it is really all very well done. And thank you for having me this year again. And thanks a lot to all of you for being here, given the very nice weather we have. And so the outside option is really a very good outside option today. So, organizer this year asked me to do something related to to Europe, and so I thought a lot, and I thought that something that is related to procurement and is really relevant in the European regulation or European setting is all the part related to the innovation. So what I'm going to do in this first lecture, I will give you some first elements about public procurement. I know that many of you are working on this topic, but others not, so please let me summarize a little bit about this topic. And then I will move very quickly to some issue about the international debate at this time on public procurement. This will somehow introduce also my second lecture, which is part of my current research. And then finally, I will focus on EU procurement of innovation, in particular on pre-commercial procurement and innovation partnership. Okay? And if you have clarification question, you are more than welcome. So, okay. So first, a couple of slides, as I mentioned, as introduction. As you know, public procurement involves the contracting out of some given task. So it could be a service, the provision of good or provision of furniture, from public administration to selected private buyers, to selected private operators. And why it is relevant? Because it represents a large share of public spending, and as you know, we are really worried about our public spending, given the economic crisis and whatever. And this is an estimate by the OECD, is about 15% of this public expenditure in many OECD countries. And what is really relevant, and we have to start with, is that public procurement is a field with a lot of regulation, okay? It's really something you have to care about, because the outcome will very much depend on the rule, how the rule is written, how it is enforced, and so on and so forth. And we have at least 4 phases in public procurement. Not all the public procurement follow this kind of phases, but we have a qualification phase in which firms apply to have some sort of qualification and then to be allowed to bid in the auction or to participate in any kind of tender. Then we have the awarding phase, which is usually done with auction or negotiation or other kind of procedure. Then we have the execution or the furniture, whatever, and some form of ending some element to some part interaction, so the contract. Public procurement is not only a topic for economists, it's a topic also for lawyers. They work very much and they do a lot of money usually on public procurement. As economists, what we are interested in, we are interested in what we call best value for money. This is something which is taken from the private procurement, okay? When a private firm is interacting with another private firm and having this kind of relation, this kind of procurement, the aim is really to have the best value for money. This is the case to find also in the same, to pursue this aim also in public procurement, but as you will see, there will be much more constraint than in private procurement. Moreover, in public procurement, could have some strategic objectives, like fostering innovation, or try to reach some environmental goals, or some redistribution issues. This part about redistribution issues is not really very much developed in terms of investigation, but it's really relevant in Russian data set about public procurement. There are some things that can be done about this way to allocate, to set aside some procurement just for specific kind of firms. What the economists usually are interested in details. First, they want to somehow see how to reduce all kind of adverse selection problem. Usually the adverse selection problem in public procurement are affecting the first phase, that is qualification and awarding phases. And in particular, we have to answer as doing with by carrying out our research, which kind of, for instance, which kind of qualification screening to adopt, or which is the best awarding procedure that should be designed for such kind of procurement. Moreover, and moving to the execution phase, yes, we will face what is usually called the moral hazard problem. So once you have when you have awarded the contract, it could be that the firms start with some moral hazard attitude, and so you should design some form of penalty or other incentive mechanism to reduce this kind of issue, which could very much affect the outcome of the contract. And finally, we should think about which could be the rules in a very different social, institutional, and political environment that would lead to the best outcome. A very interesting question is, for instance, which kind of rules could better fit the aim to reduce corruption in a specific setting, okay? This is just to give you the kind of issues that could be addressed and are interesting for public procurement. If we have a focus on what we could do with the data on public procurement, first we can see that in the recent year we had a very large increase of empirical analysis, as it has been in other fields. And from what I told you since now, it could appear that public procurement is really a field in which it is nice, it is good, it is could be easy to assess the effect of different regulation and of the quality of institutions that are developing this kind of regulation, as well as the kind of buyers are interacting in this public procurement setting and whatever. Why this? Because in public procurement, the regulation of this kind of process is explicit, okay? It should be rules that provide stuff to be verifiable, okay? Moreover, you can imagine that we have public procurement in many countries, different regions. We have, as I mentioned before, different kind of tenders, so different kind of contracts. So all this kind of heterogeneity could lead to nice empirical investigation, as well as different kind of contracting authority and other elements peculiar of each setting. Moreover, as you may know, in different countries, this data on public procurement at micro level are collected, as well as data on public expenditure. But the real work in this kind of field, in empirical public procurement, is not so nice as it could appear. Why? Because we have empirical problem as related to the usual confounding factors. And as we know, we could apply econometric technique, which could help to evaluate causal impact in this kind of micro data set, and so could help in refining our identification strategy. The problem, as we know, is that this kind of technique, they need randomly assigned changes or threshold or whatever. And usually in public procurement, new rules come out not from something that you couldn't expect, because they are very much discussed at political level with the firms, because they provide a lot of effects in this kind of market. So this is why sometimes it's very difficult to find randomly assigned changes that help in our empirical analysis. And moreover, another feature that we have to consider is that sometimes we have a large data set, but the quality of this data set is poor. And here there is an open question, and which is about the fact if this poor data collection is really an endogenous problem, so is related to some sort of poor institutional organization or other kind of aims, other kind of elements. So what is good to do just to approach this kind of problem with the empirical research in public procurement? First of all, it is useful to complement this new technique, this econometric technique that are very nice to be adopted, with some explanation, so narrative analysis about the regulation, so how it comes from, and what are the reasons that move to regulate in that way. For instance, in Italy, we had at a certain point the entry of a very tough regulation in public procurement, and that was a reaction to a very large corruption period they discovered. And so, when you take the data around that period and you want to evaluate this regulation, it is really important to stress why rules went designed in such a way. Moreover, what would be nice is to observe firms, the same firm more times, and usually for a longer period. So in this way you can really work with a fixed effect, and this would mitigate the usual problem of omitted variable. And moreover, it is easier to work on, as you may know, with the simple and a unique country with respect to compare procurement in different countries because of different institutional culture and way to do business in the different setting. Okay. Now, given this very short very short presentation about some issues on public procurement, let me discuss a little bit about the international debate on public procurement, just referring the recent or relevant issue which started in the US, and which were at least two, and related first on the issue on how much discretion to give to public buyers, mainly in the attempt to reduce transaction cost. This is really a relevant issue, is still an open debate, and as you will see in my second lecture, in which I will present research which is going on, we really focus on this kind of issue because we investigate the public buyer ability and how this ability could affect the final price in the awarding of public procurement for medical devices. Obviously, it is not easy to identify this public buyer ability, but you will see, and we will discuss later on this topic. Why is relevant this point? Because in private procurement, as you can imagine, there are not all these rules as in public procurement. Why? Because in public procurement you have to spend public resources, and you really want not to be affected by corruption or other kind of favoritism or whatever. In private procurement, usually the firm which is designing this procurement is really free to do rules just for that kind of interaction, to stop the contract, you know, and to change a lot of stuff. While this is not possible in public procurement, in which you find really very tough kind of procedure. But the point is, if you give discretion to a public buyer, which is not with a high ability, this could really give more room to further corruption, to favoritism, or simply to inefficiency. Okay, so you see, this is the trade-off. The other point, which is really an open question in the debate, is if or whether to use reputational indicators based on past performance. Why this is an open question? Because if you use this kind of reputational indicators, as this is usually done in private procurement, you really could reduce the ability or the possibility of new firms, in terms of firms that didn't have a previous contract, previous public procurement contract, to enter the market. Okay, so there are papers which are investigating which kind of rules and which kind of public procurement design could include a reputational indicator, but at the same time do not close or limit the entry of new firms. So in particular, young firms or small firms or whatever. And this is really a debate on this point, which is very open at European level, but also still in the US. There are some official documents in which they discuss about the pros and cons of this kind of feature. In Europe, to include reputational indicators somehow is forbidden, and the debate is open on how it could be possible to include without limiting competition, since this is could be the effect. Now, moving to the European public procurement, the debate is much focused on some topics, and in particular I just mentioned the more recent, which has been included in what is called European Green Paper on Public Procurement 2011, and the novelty with respect to the directives 2004 were about how to foster the participation of small and medium firms in this kind of, we can say, business. Why? Because having descriptive statistics, you can see that in all this kind of public procurement, think about construction, think about medical devices, think about furniture or whatever, the participation is mostly by large firm. It is very difficult, or the participation of small firm is really very reduced. And since small and medium firm, they do have a relevant role in European countries, this could be something to be to pay attention to. The other point, as Andy we will see in a while, is how to foster public procurement, how to foster innovation through public procurement. I'm sure that you have plenty of examples in which you can see that you have seen that the computers or the materials which are at usage of public administration is usually the oldest one. Okay, so it means that also when there are new technologies, public procurement is for when there is also if there is there are new and better technologies, public procurement is addressed to the oldest one. So and this is really a big damage for innovation by itself. So at the European level, and we will see also with some data later on, given the problem of lack of innovation, they start saying and they start stressing that public procurement could be a way to force the adoption and to provide incentive for innovation. And finally, there is all the environmental issue. So how public procurement can force firm to be somehow green, okay, in what they sell to the public administration. A second part of this green paper, as I mentioned before, is about some indication on how to include a reputational indicator in this kind of process. And another step in this European public procurement is for sure this not anymore new, but the Directives 2014, in which there are some of these elements with the rules and as we will see, especially for innovation. So, as I just told briefly, I'm focusing on this part on European public procurement for innovation, and as I mentioned, it is well known that Europe is well behind with respect to investment in innovation, and with all the declaration about Europe 2020, the aim is to reach 3% of investment in research and development by 2020. And at this time, we are still around 2%. With some descriptive statistics, we can see that this lower growth and this productivity gap we have in Europe is very much related to the lower level of investment in this research and innovation. There is a use very low about ECT, and in some part of the business and interaction in the society, there is really a low level of innovation. This is documented by general data, like for instance that the 75% of the gross expenditure in R&D is executed outside Europe. 79% of patent applications are made outside Europe, as well as the largest part of researchers are working outside Europe. So all this kind of information really contribute in designing this public procurement for innovation. This is a slide that it is not useful for you, since, but it is just to remind why innovation could be incentivized through a public policy. Just the seminal paper by Solo in 1957 about the growth of GDP in the US. Then what is really important is that there is this kind of challenges which are related to the aging of the population, climate change, energy efficiency, and all this is really very much connected to innovation. And moreover, there is this part about micro issues related to all the stuff on market failures, which lead to underinvestment in innovation, and which could be taken into consideration, which should be taken into consideration, and somehow, again, justify the fact that these public resources through public procurement could be really addressed to buy new product, to develop new procedure and furniture and whatever. Okay, this is implication is the usual one. Now, public policy for innovation has been usually done through what are called supply-side policies, in which governments somehow provide incentive to innovation through this kind of tools, grants, tax incentives, direct subsidies, direct involvement of public programs in innovation and whatever, okay? But given, at least for Europe, this kind of setting, the real question is that we couldn't come back or go on with this kind of policy, since this policy produced this kind of setting with very low innovation. So the idea is to move to the demand side policy, okay? And having the aim to develop demand side policy means that the public sector, so public buyer, should become a promoter of innovation, okay? And this is really a big change. Thinking about how to include this innovation to be something good in terms of social welfare. Usually in Europe you have this kind of picture in which you see that the idea is to reach what is called an open government, or if you want a public buyer, which should be pursued through some sort of policy with open data, so all the ICT program for public administration, open services, and open processes in terms of public procurement, investment, whatever. And what is really among this kind of field is that there should be a form of transparency in what the government is doing for reaching this kind of goals. And what is relevant for what I'm going to say is some form of collaboration, okay? And with respect to the private sector, with respect to the public procurement, collaboration will be with the private sector. So the tools that at the European level have been defined to pursue this public procurement for innovation has been pre-commercial procurement, public procurement of innovation, and innovation partnership. These first two in the same line are somehow related, while this one has more differences. So what I'm going to do is to present pre-commercial procurement and innovation partnership, and then to see what could be the best field where to apply each one of these. Now, let's start with this picture in which you have the typical product innovation life cycle. I'm sure that you have seen other times. And here on the bottom bar, you can see somehow the way in which the innovation move on. You have a product idea, the solution design, the prototype, then first test products, and then the commercial part of this innovation. And what is to be taken from this slide is that this kind of innovation timing could be somehow divided in two parts. The first one is product-driven research, this part, in which all these phases are really to address the innovation. And then there is another part, which is somehow very different, in which you try to commercialize the innovation. Why this is relevant? Because, or this is relevant, this the share in these two parts, because pre-commercial procurement really ground on this idea. In particular, okay, first, pre-commercial procurement is not completely new, but is new in the way in which it has been adopted and in the way in which they try to implement since 2014. The important part is that, as I mentioned in this slide, there is somehow an unbundling between the two phases, the research and development phases. Sorry, and here there is a mistake, is a commercialization, okay? So there is unbundling between the two, and the public buyer, which is implementing this kind of pre-commercial public procurement, has no commitment to purchase since the beginning what it is incentivizing. In this process, you have benefits and risk, and having this unbundling, you have that this is public administration, so the public buyer or the public administration could not reserve exclusive use, okay? This means that the public administration gets free license and could exploit this kind of innovation for its own usage, okay? While at the same time, the firms could get the intellectual property right on this innovation and could promote it also in the open market, okay? So this is some sort of sharing of benefit, and this is really relevant because the higher is the perspective of this property rights in terms of future exploitation, and the lower will be the contribution by the public administration to this process in terms of incentives or in terms of resources just to start this kind of process, okay? And indeed, this is somehow a way to share the risk about innovation, because if the part by the resources by the public administration could be lower because of this sharing of the usage and innovation and intellectual property right, there could be really a good advantage in starting this innovation process. What is really important is that there is a competitive development in phases, and the other characteristic is that there is a multiple sourcing. So there should be at least two funded enterprises, and this is the picture about pre-commercial public procurement. You see that you have an initial pre-commercial tendering in which the public administration present the innovation it is interested in, and some firms will propose some solution, there is a sort of first evaluation by the public administration of this different solution. Then you see the number of competitors reduce to reach the prototyping phase. So not all the solution will reach the prototyping phase. Then you have at least 2 final company in this phase 3, in which there is the development of this kind of innovation. And then, and this is relevant, the process of this part of competition in the development of the innovation stops. The public administration takes the innovation and put on the market, opening a tendering on who would be the developer of this kind of innovation. So it opens again the competition among all the firms and even other firms, okay? So somehow you have a competition in this part of developing the innovation, and what is more relevant, you have competition in the commercialization and the way in which you really organize the production of this kind of innovation and product. Now, let's move to the other tool, which is innovation partnership. This is differently from public from the PCP. This is really somehow a new procedure which has been included in the Directive 2014. And here the difference is that the 2 phases, developing and research and development, and the production or the production and commercialization phases are bundled. So the public administration has the commitment to purchase if the requirements which the public administration has set at the very beginning are satisfied, okay? So we have this development in phases in which there are a few firms, but what is really relevant is that those who participate in this competition in the development, they know very well that if they go on towards the production, they do not have a sort of competition, but they will be financed also or incentivized also in that phase. So what is really relevant is the difference between the bundling and the unbundling between the 2 phases. And what is also relevant is that the estimated value of supplies should be not disproportionate with respect to the research and development investment. Why? Because the public administration usually starts this kind of innovation partnership because it has a very specific issue to solve and to propose for an innovation, okay? But it cannot ask for a huge investment in this kind of innovation if the supply, this administration will ask later on is not in somehow proportionate to the investment required. Here, so you have the same picture as before, but not anymore this kind of segmentation between the 2 phases. So, what are the potential advantages between for the innovation partnership? For sure, you have that you can exploit the economies of scales between the 2 phases, between research and development and production, and this could lead to a final lower cost in terms of the product you reach. Moreover, and these are 2 relevant effects, if you have this bundle of the 2 phases, you have that the firms which participate in this innovation partnership, they do have incentive of making an investment because they know that if they reach the innovation and this satisfies all the requirement by the public administration, then they will have also the commercialization phase that they could carry on by themselves. And moreover, this bundling imply also that the commercial risk by the firm is also reduced. So somehow there is a direct incentive to start with innovation because you reduce different kind of uncertainty. On the other hand, and this is somehow referring to, yes?
Do the firms get compensation during the R&D phase?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
In both procedures?
In both the procedure, yes. They start with some sort of monetary incentive for the development, and then it depends on the commercialization, because in the PCP, since if the public administration has just the usage and not the IPR, this means that the private firm could gain by its own commercialization, and so the incentive at the very beginning will be lower, because they know that then they could sell the innovation in the open market. While if the public administration takes also the IPR in this kind of PCP, the incentive to start with the innovation process, the research and development, should be higher, because then this kind of innovation could be sold just for this public administration. Okay? Other questions? Yes, please.
My question is about, in both of the structures, who retains the intellectual rights, patents? Because if the innovators don't have those, they would not be interested in participation in either of this, because if government has the rights, then what's the purpose of doing the innovation?
Okay, if we are back to this picture, okay, you see that here there is the incentive by the public administration in doing research and development, okay? Then here the public administration takes the innovation, okay, and open a new tender for everyone which wants to produce this kind of innovation, okay? In this way, it's the public administration that takes the intellectual property right, so it means that the incentive to start the innovation should be very high, because there is a lot of uncertainty that one of these firms will take the production, okay? So what is really relevant is the balance between the level of incentive in this phase and the commercialization later on. Because if the public administration let the commercialization to the private firm, so the private firms takes the IPR, the incentives in this phase will be lower.
I do understand the differences between these two approaches in terms of the risk of the commercialization, but who retains the rights of the innovation? Because if it's a highly valued innovation and the government just takes away, then who would want to give it up to offer it to produce among many different firms?
All the stuff about intellectual property rights should be decided in each mechanism. But the difference is that in PCP, the public administration could decide to let the IPR to the firm, okay, and accordingly should decide the level of incentive in this phase. But at the same time could decide, no, I will have all the property rights, and so in that case it should give a lot of incentive to make this firm participating in this phase, competing in this phase. Because the risk of putting money in this innovation is even higher, since they will not have the commercialization for the open market.
Okay, so I understand that there is no uniform approach, exactly. And therefore the outcomes between these two different forms can be different depending on
but
structure.
Now you will see the real difference. In any case, the part on definition of intellectual property rights is a key one, and it seems that just experience in different fields, experience in different sectors, different kind of application of this mechanism will give some answer, because it is not, by definition that you have this kind of allocation of property rights. And I think I was here. Yes, the risk of this innovation partnership is really large, mainly related to the ability of the public administration, because in the innovation partnership, since there is this bundling since the very beginning, the public administration should know since the very beginning what is the real need, how to proceed, so on and so forth. And if the innovation which is produced by the different firms is not the one that the public administration wants, it should be able to stop it, because it will not provide the gain expected. So in the innovation partnership, it is really relevant, more than in the other case, the public administration ability. Moreover, as you will see in a while, this kind of mechanism could be really, could create a really difficult access for small and medium firms. And how we can see that it could create a problem for the access of small and medium firms, the innovation partnership. Let's have this example. You have here in the two graph, in the vertical axis, you have efficiency in production, while in the horizontal, you have efficiency in innovation. Let's take three firms, A, B, and C, and let's have a correlated ranking between efficiency in production and efficiency in innovation. You have that here in this graph, you have that firm A will be the one which is both efficient in production and in innovation, okay? In the other picture, you have that efficiency in production and efficiency in innovation are not are uncorrelated, and you could have, differently from before, that the firm C is efficient in production, while the firm B is efficient in innovation, okay? And the firm A, which was here, now is in the middle. Now, assume that the firm B is a small-medium firm. You have that in this case, where there is the ranking which is uncorrelated, so there is the unbundling between the two phases, the production and the research and development and the production. You can have that the small and medium firm could win this part of this part of the process, so the first phase. While here, it is for sure that the firm B, that is the small and medium firm, where the two phases are correlated, it seems that it will be that the firm B will not win and maybe will not even participate to this kind of process, okay? So this is just a very simple way to show the effect. Now, just to sum up, we have that considering in the simplest way elements like technological risk, the public administration specificity, that is the aim of this kind of innovation, how much is specific to that public administration, differently from how large could be the market that this innovation produced for that public administration then could have a proper market by itself. Then how large is the innovation included in that product? If there is the low or high presence of economies of scale, and if you have you plan to have a role for small and medium firm, you can see that having this kind of elements with low and high dimension, you see that when you have a technological risk, high technological risk, it's better to adopt the PCP because you have more competition in the first phase as separated by the second one. When you have some sort of very specific innovation to be addressed with this kind of contract, it's better to use the innovation partnership. If the innovation again is should be if the innovation should be very strong, it's better to go for the PCP. Economies of scope, high economies of scope, is better to have the innovation partnership, which is an usual result in the bundling literature. And moreover, if you want to address the participation of small and medium firms, it's better to go with the PCP, as I mentioned before. So, just to conclude and to open to your question, I think that this sentence from OECD report on this kind of stuff, innovation through public resources to public procurement, is really relevant. So if we want to move on with this kind of contract design, we could do, knowing that we are doing some sort of novel stuff, so we should be very careful and be in the position to change time to time to adapt this mechanism to what we want to get in terms of innovation and efficiency outcome. But moreover, it should be very clear that we cannot solve the problem just by demand-side policy. We should go on with supply-side policy in terms of grant, in terms of tax cut for giving incentive to innovation in this respect. And I think this is all. And I stop here. Maybe I take this one, like, okay.
Paola,
Yep.
if I could make a comment, forgive me if I'm impolite.
Sorry?
Forgive me if I'm a little impolite, but I'm skeptical of this entire literature for the following reason. Number one, I've seen this literature before, and the mere fact that they compare levels of R&D in the US and Europe as evidence of poor success in Europe is suspect, and it's not provable for the following reason. If you think about most of US government R&D, it's public knowledge except for military stuff. So in fact, Europe should be free riding off that. So it's not clear why their unwillingness to spend in terms of the public R&D is a direct cost if they can free ride off US technology. So the first thing you need to study is ask, why is it when there's publicly available technology, Europe was not able to develop it? A very good example is how Japan grew. In the same period that Japan was growing, what did they use? Transistor radio, television, magnetic tape, videotape. These were all invented in the United States.
Yeah.
And Japan developed them, but Europe did not. So if Europe could not develop publicly available technology when they didn't even have to pay its costs of development, why should you assume that increasing the level of government R&D will have a dramatic effect on innovation? That's one. Secondly, there's no evidence that I've seen that US procurement is particularly good. If you look at the major source of US procurement and spending, it's on healthcare, which is in fact, and health innovation, which is in fact one of the least productive parts of the American economy. I believe I've seen studies that the 6 major contributors to big US productivity changes since the 80s have been Walmart, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, not one of which was tied to the government.
Yeah.
I was actually, I remember in the 90s, I was at a special conference on innovation and the future it was paid for by Silicon Valley. I was the only academic there. The people included the number 2 and 3, Microsoft, Corel, Eric Schmidt was there before he moved and became head of Google. So all the top guys from Silicon Valley were there. And there were a bunch of top Europeans. One of the French guys kept asking the Silicon Valley guys, they said, how can we create, this is literally what the question they asked. They said, how can we create a French Silicon Valley that we can subsidize and regulate? You know what the Silicon Valley guys said, right? They just laughed. And they said, you're missing the point, right? And so, in fact, it's relevant to the point I made before that if you think about the firms in America which were most tied to high-tech and government contracts, they were surrounding Boston. So there was at one point on Route 128 in the 1970s, which included places that like Wang Computers, and then Digital Electronic, and then IBM near there in New York, and also then AOL, they failed. It is actually California, which everyone dismissed in the 70s and 80s, which is where all the material grew. And so I wonder whether there's been any research first that says there's any hope. So one way to think about this is to sort of say, even if you could adopt best practice technique around the world, is there any evidence that best practice technique is a major contributor to net American, say, productivity?
Okay, on this point, I do not have an answer, but for sure, thinking about the, for instance, the innovation partnership, in the literature, there is a lot of debate about what they call the adaptive innovation partnership and completely new innovation for innovation partnership. What is the difference? The idea is that it could take a lot of resources to adapt an innovation from the private sector to what is the aim or the setting of the public administration. So this kind of innovation partnership could be just an adaptive one, that is, cooperate, put money in cooperation with the innovator firm, a private one, which has its own market for that innovation, but to adapt it for the public administration. And then, given these resources for this aim, just to try to do a sort of networking for innovation in the public sector setting. So I take your point, but at the same time, you should take the point that, at least in Europe, public administration is really working with very low innovation stuff. And this could be something that create efficiency, at least in terms of spending and in terms of its own work, the aim of the public administration. Then the second point is how much this kind of innovation in public administration could lead to growth or to relevant outcomes. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I do not have a question, and there is a lot of, not a lot, but I saw some investigation which has mixed results. For sure, I cannot answer with one word or a proper answer, so I stop here. But I think that the adaptive innovation is something relevant.
So you had a slide with the challenges that innovation in Europe has in a way.
Yeah.
And maybe I didn't see this, but I wanted to ask, is there also like an international competition factor? Like if I'm a smart Swedish guy and I have an idea for an app, why should I develop my app in Sweden? I would move to Silicon Valley. So I don't know how.
This one? No. What it was?
I don't know whether like the international competition in a way is an issue. Like in a sense, if I have a good idea, why should I do? Why not move into the Silicon Valley to develop my app instead of staying in Europe? So I don't know whether how that fits the picture.
It depends again on resources. If you are able to be financed for your very brilliant idea and go to the Silicon Valley, yes, I agree with you. But if you are a small firm or a local firm and you have credit issues in terms of money for your research and development, whatever, it could be that the local one or other kind of public operator are interested, and this kind of partnership could be a way just to finance at least the first phase, if even not the second one, if you are able then to win the competition for the commercialization in the PCP, or just to convince the public administrator to buy it and so to produce it.
Yeah, okay. I guess the point I wanted to make, like this, how do you say it? Design have to look competitive relative to the option of going somewhere else, I guess. I don't know whether how much that is taken in consideration.
Could you repeat, sorry?
Sorry, but like, the point I was trying to make is that part of the design of these policies should take into account that someone has also the option of going somewhere else.
Yes.
So, for instance, I don't know, there's a UPF shuttle laboratory for innovation in our university, and we had a case of a guy that went through the UPF mechanisms to develop a new app. Since the process was too complicated, the guy said, you know what, I'm going to go elsewhere to do it because I don't have to deal with all of this. I don't know how much public administration also takes into account that you actually have other ways of getting money.
Yeah, it is a matching process because if it is not, if you are not a firm with your own resources and a very good idea, you can have all this kind of issue on how to finance and then to develop the proper application for a market. We know very well that a lot of innovation, they were very good, but they were not exploited at that time. They need to wait for 10 years, 6 years, whatever, to find, the proper application. So, as I mentioned before, it's a matching process, and maybe the only point that this kind of partnership, for me, say in a relevant way is that they could propose some sort of collaboration in this very difficult process just to reduce the uncertainty of the initial investment. That's all. Then very different rules and design could come. Yes, please.
I have a question in general, how this is related to the presence of private equity in certain countries. So if I hear the question of John, it seems to me that the big difference between Europe, at least in the past, and the US was we need these kind of things because there's no private equity market. And so if I have an idea and a firm and I can't find the financing, I either go to Silicon Valley or I have to turn to the government. But I think also this is changing, and it's fastly changing. So I think Europe is very quickly developing a private equity market. So let me tell you a story of myself. I did a little startup 3 years ago. We first went to the government for like an innovation subsidy. We got something, we started. Then we start hiring people, make our products. It's an online product. And then eventually we did a capital round, not in Silicon Valley, but in Europe, a big one, and it worked. So I think very quickly these things are changing, and Europe is moving to a more US market-based finance model. And I think this is much more important than the discussion between Silicon Valley and the European model. The question really is, are we market-based or bank-based? And if you're going to be more market-based, I think these models will become less important in later phases. They will retain importance for the startup phase, the very, very initial beginning. But then more and more people will, I think, turn to the markets. But I would like to hear your view on that.
I'm not an expert of equity, but in any case, I think that this kind of stuff could be useful as a starting process for the innovation itself, but mainly for changes in the public administration. So, but again, the real issue is how to have very good public administrators that they are able to understand what could be done to become more efficient or to reduce corruption with transparencies on data and whatever. And so we are again to the main point. To me, this kind of stuff done at European level, should be taken as a way to think about there is an issue and this could be a way, but for sure it is not the only way. Maybe you're right that given the progress in all this kind of part on equity and whatever, that could be, for instance, for sure. Yes, exactly. Or even complementary, we don't know, so.
Okay, it's time to stop now, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Paola.
Thank you.